Hi guys, and welcome to Biological Sciences for Year 10. This is Activity 16, where I'm going to introduce to you the concept of natural selection. Okay, now in the previous video we basically got over the idea that when we were looking at the concept of wolves turning into dogs, often man was the main decider as to what traits or characteristics were going to be passed from one organism to the next. Now, natural selection looks at the environment. When we talk about natural selection, it's nature basically selecting what characteristics are going to be expressed and what characteristics are going to be removed. Now, when we talk about removal, it's basically because the organism dies. And why does the organism die? Well, basically, the organism's characteristics are not good enough for them to do a specific job. For example, if you've got a cheetah that basically can't run particularly fast, it's not going to be able to capture its own food. Because it can't capture its own food, it's going to die from starvation. So that's nature selecting that trait to be removed. However, if you've got a cheetah who's got a particularly long tail which allows it to balance as it's making a turn at high speeds, then that cheetah, that characteristic, is going to be more successful at collecting and hunting food. So as a result, as it turns, it'll get more food. More food means it survives, and so that characteristic has the ability to pass on. Okay, so how is it that nature actually selects for those characteristics? Well, one of the things that we can look at is the environment. Now, the environment itself, if we go way, way back to the beginning of time, we get the idea that scientists believe that all the continents were together. And using the concept of continental drift, which we studied in year 9, we've got this idea that continents moved apart. Now, as they move apart, they're moving to different positions on the planet. Moving to different positions on the planet means that you can change your climate. And by changing your climate and by continents being able to lift up or drop down or what have you, what you get is different environments. So freshwater could become saltwater. What could have been once under the ground then becomes grassland and comes up to the surface. So over millions of years, organisms have had to adapt to this changing in the actual planet's surface. So one thing that we can look at is the particular environment. So if we look at those in turn, the first one we've got maybe is freshwater. Now, we all know that in Australia we've got freshwater crocodiles. Freshwater crocodiles will not be able to go into a saltwater environment. Their bodies are not designed to deal with that high concentration of salt. Likewise, we've got saltwater organisms which then can't cross that barrier into freshwater. So you get this barrier which occurs between the freshwater river and then the saltwater sea coming together. And at this point, you're going to get some organisms that they're so diverse they just can't cross over. And then you get some organisms, for example, the bull shark. The bull shark is able to actually cross from saltwater into freshwater. That's why often here on the Gold Coast we have a number of bull sharks which basically will cross that boundary from seawater into freshwater, from high salt areas to no salt areas. So there's one example. We've then got deserts. Now you think of a penguin. A penguin would not be able to survive in a desert, but a camel is able to survive. It has specifically got adaptations which allow it to work very, very successfully in the desert areas. And you can talk about a variety of different organisms. For example, some lizards. Some lizards will be able to survive on the desert, and their whole characteristics allow them to deal with the heat. For example, some lizards will stand on 2 feet. They'll lift two parts of their bodies up, the front leg and then the back leg, and then swap over. And by swapping over from one to the other, there's less contact with the sand, which means there's less heat transfer so that the lizard doesn't overheat. Some lizards at night time will almost freeze as it gets really, really cold, and they will allow their bodies to drop down and the heart rates to drop down so that they can virtually survive that freezing. And then when the sun comes up, they thaw, they get enough heat, and then they run off. Sidewinder snakes. basically don't slither so that the whole body is in contact with the sand. What they'll do is they'll drop parts of their body so it touches the sand so that they can move and push off, but the rest of the body is lifted above the sand. Again, these are adaptations that nature has allowed to exist so that that organism can survive in that specific arid environment. Grasslands. Grasslands may at one time have been a river estuary or even the sea. They've got high nitrate levels, and as a result grass can survive. From this we probably get our sheep and our cattle and your horses. Those sorts of animals that survive off grassy areas will adapt themselves to this area. Maybe horses grew long legs because the high grassland the long legs allowed them to run through the grass very, very easily. Who knows? But all of these are selections that nature has devised. In Australia, we've got the eucalyptus forest. We know that the koala eats eucalyptus. Same would work for like the panda in China. It has survived and eats only on bamboo shoots. We cut down the bamboo, the panda's going to die. Why? Can't get any food. It hasn't had an adaptation that allows it to survive on a different type of food. So that's why we get organisms that maybe become extinct. But nature has allowed those characteristics to be expressed because of the abundance of the environment and the ability for that characteristic to exploit that environment. We look at Iceland, and Iceland basically is anything with ice. So there's fish that may have antifreeze or a form of antifreeze in their blood so that they're allowed to swim around and their blood won't freeze. You've got the formation of blubber on the outside, like in this seal here or walrus. And what the blubber does is allow them to actually conserve heat. You've got a variety of different adaptations which allow that organism to adapt. Now, was that adaptation down to an organism developing it and then moving to this area? Probably not. It's more likely that the organism was on that continent at the time or moved to that continent, and then because that continent split away and went to various different parts of the world, it then had to adapt to the change in climate. So this is one area where climate is going to have a major factor on whether its characteristics for that organism are going to be naturally selected. Some other characteristics would include things like the ability to get oxygen, food, suitable temperatures. Plants have evolved so that they are able to get sunlight so that they can do photosynthesis. They've produced transfer mechanisms within the stems to transport water and nitrates from the soil up to the leaves where photosynthesis is going to occur and then move back down. This has been decided for by nature. Certain organisms will have the ability to prevent being eaten by predators. For example, certain bugs turn green so that they look almost like a leaf. Some bugs have basically turned into thorns so that they can blend in with their environment, and because of that, they're not going to be eaten. Now, this is nature selecting that characteristic for the direct reason that that organism survives. Obviously, if you aren't able to blend in, if you're like a red bug on a green leaf, you're going to be seen, you're going to be eaten. But a green bug on a green leaf, hey, you're basically going to survive, so that means you have better chance of passing on your offspring. Now, obviously, in order for the characteristics to be passed on, you have to have an organism which is going to be able to reproduce and reproduce successfully. So there's another catch in there. Each organism must find a mate. If you find a mate and you successfully reproduce, there's a good chance of those characteristics being passed on. Now, obviously these characteristics we call adaptations, basically because that characteristic has allowed that organism to adapt to a specific environment. And this adaptation, as we talked about earlier, is directly related to a mutation of a specific gene. A change in maybe a base code or a number of base codes or a removal of base codes, which then allow an amino acid to be placed in. Okay, now as a result, we've got a variety of different types of life around the planet, and we call this biodiversity It's the diversity that happens within living things, the bio part being living, diversity being all the differences, variations that we've got. And as a result, this process which was put forward by Charles Darwin, we call natural selection. Another word you may have, or phrase that you may have heard, is survival of the fittest. And what we talk about there is survival of the fittest is the characteristics which allow an organism to adapt to an environment and exploit that environment to its specific needs so that it can reproduce and pass on its characteristics to young. Well, I hope you found that useful. I've linked in 2 videos to this on this post in this iTunes U course. One of them is done by Clearly Stated, and the other one is by Khan Academy. They really do a good job at trying to explain natural selection. So after watching this, I hope you'll go on and watch those other 2 videos. They're not particularly long, but I feel that they explain natural selection in a visual sense, which is going to enhance your understanding. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful, and I look forward to you joining me again. Thanks for watching.